There is a kind of contract that is never fully written, the kind where the ink is visible, but the real terms live somewhere beneath the page, pressed into the paper by a hand that knows more than it shows. Amara Osei had signed her name on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a law office that smelled of cedar and cold air, with a pen that felt heavier than any object that small had the right to feel. She had told herself it was a business arrangement, clean, temporary, survivable. She had told herself that a woman who understood numbers, who had spent 7 years as a forensic financial analyst, dismantling fraudulent ledgers for a living, would never be outmaneuvered by a contract. She had been wrong about that. Not about the numbers, about what the contract was actually for. If you have ever made a decision with your whole heart that turned out to be based on half the information, stay with this story. Because what Amara discovered 3 weeks into her arrangement with Kenji Mori was not a betrayal in the ordinary sense. It was something more disorienting than that. It was the revelation that she had been both deceived and in a way she had not yet found language for, quietly protected, and that these two things had been happening simultaneously from the very first signature. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, this channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about women who walk into rooms where the rules were written without them, and walk out having rewritten something fundamental. Subscribe now and stay with us, because this story has a turn in it that will change the shape of what you thought you were watching. Amara had come to Osaka 6 months before the contract, following a corporate audit assignment that had stretched into something longer. She was good at her work in the way that people who learned discipline from scarcity tend to be: precise, relentless, emotionally detached from the numbers in front of her, even when those numbers told ugly stories about people in expensive suits. She had grown up in London, the daughter of a Ghanaian father who fixed electronics, and a Jamaican mother who cleaned offices at night and took accounting courses in the morning. Neither of them had taught her to be afraid of powerful men. They had taught her to read the room, understand the structure, and find the exit before she needed it. The assignment in Osaka had nothing to do with Kenji Mori. It had to do with a shipping logistics company, with creative bookkeeping, and a board that had decided a black British woman with no local connections was the safest choice to review their internal ledgers, meaning they assumed she could be managed. They had miscalculated, as people often did. Amara had found the irregularities within the first week. By the third week, she had traced the discrepancy to a shell account registered to a holding company she had never heard of, and by the time her supervisor in London called to tell her the assignment had been quietly terminated and her findings were to be sealed, she had already made a copy. She did not intend to do anything reckless with that copy. She was not a crusader. She was a woman whose younger sister, Nadia, was in a private rehabilitation facility in Bristol that cost more per month than most people earned in 3, receiving treatment for a spinal injury that had left her partially paralyzed after a car accident 18 months prior. The facility was the only one in Britain with the specific program Nadia needed. The waiting list for public support was 4 years long. Amara paid out of pocket every month, with a precision that left almost nothing for anything else. When the assignment was terminated, she lost the contract bonus that had been the financial architecture of the next 6 months, and 3 days later, she received a call from the facility administrator with the kind of gentle, apologetic voice that precedes devastating news. She had 48 hours before Nadia's placement would be offered to the next person on the waiting list. It was in that window, that narrow, airless 48 hours, that a woman named Yuki Matsumoto appeared at the door of Amara's rented apartment with a manila envelope, a business card, and a proposition so precise in its timing that it would only later occur to Amara to ask how anyone had known exactly when to knock. The envelope contained a contract. The contract described a private marriage arrangement, legally structured as a civil partnership under international residential law, between Amara Osei and Kenji Mori, CEO of Mori Holdings and managing director of several subsidiary enterprises across Osaka, Tokyo, and Kobe. The terms were clear. She would reside in his Osaka residence for a minimum of 1 year, attend specific public engagements as his partner, maintain confidentiality regarding all aspects of the arrangement, and in return receive a sum that would cover Nadia's facility fees for the next 3 years, plus a monthly living allowance, plus a formal letter of employment as a financial consultant to Mori Holdings to explain her presence in Japan to anyone who required an explanation. The contract said nothing about love. It said nothing about intimacy. It said nothing about danger. Amara had read it 3 times. She had noted the clauses, examined the termination conditions, assessed the financial guarantees. Everything was verifiable. The sum was already in escrow, confirmed by a brief call to the account number listed on the final page. She had asked Yuki one question: why her? Yuki had said without blinking that Mr. Mori required a partner who was unconnected to any existing social or professional networks in Japan, who was professionally credible, and who had demonstrated an ability to manage sensitive information with discretion. Amara had understood this as a compliment to her competence. She had not yet understood it as a description of her disposability. She had signed on the 41st hour. Kenji Mori was not what she had expected, though she could not have articulated precisely what she had expected. He was 41 years old, lean and composed in a way that suggested long practice rather than natural ease. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away publicly, but changed entirely in the space of an unguarded moment, which was rare. But she would come to notice those moments the way you notice cracks in walls you are learning to live inside. He received her arrival at his residence with a courtesy that was neither warm nor cold, but had the quality of deep formality, as though he had made a decision that she would be treated with a specific kind of respect and was executing that decision without deviation. He showed her the wing of the house that was hers. He gave her a schedule of the engagements that would require her presence. He introduced her to his household staff with her correct name, pronounced properly, which she noted. He did not ask her personal questions. He did not comment on her appearance. He did not attempt to construct a false intimacy. At the end of the first evening, when they sat briefly in the same room before she retired, he said, without looking up from the document in his hand, "I understand you are a forensic analyst. If you find anything in the household accounts that concerns you, you should tell me directly." She had not known what to do with that. The first 2 weeks passed in a structured quiet. She attended 3 functions: a gallery opening, a corporate dinner, a private reception at a hotel in the Umeda district. She wore clothes that Yuki had arranged and which fit her precisely, which she found both practical and slightly unnerving. At each event, Kenji stood at the right distance, introduced her with the right level of warmth, and said nothing that was technically untrue. He was good at the performance of closeness, without offering any of its actual substance. She had told herself she did not care about that. On the 17th day, a man named Tadashi Kurosawa came to the house. Amara had been in the study Kenji had assigned to her, working on a financial review he had formally requested, an entirely legitimate document, she had confirmed, for a real subsidiary with genuine operational costs. She heard the front door, and then voices that moved through the hallway with the kind of contained aggression that furniture absorbs and rooms remember. She did not go to the door, but she heard Kurosawa say in Japanese that she was only partially able to follow, a phrase she later had translated by a dictionary application. She has no idea what she is standing in the middle of. It was the specificity of that sentence that stayed with her. Not she does not know, she has no idea what she is standing in the middle of. That was a spatial phrase, a phrase about position, a phrase that implied she was not incidentally present, but centrally placed. She began with the careful, methodical precision of someone who had spent years finding what ledgers were designed to conceal, to look. It took her 4 days to understand the first layer. Mori Holdings was legitimate, genuinely, thoroughly legitimate, which was itself notable given its scale. Kenji Mori was not running a criminal empire. He was, as far as every verifiable record indicated, a businessman. But he was also, and this took another 2 days to confirm, the estranged eldest son of a man named Hiroshi Mori, who had been the external financial administrator of the Kurosawa Syndicate, one of the most embedded crime organizations in the Kansai region, for 22 years before dying of a stroke 4 years ago. Kenji had not inherited that role. He had, in fact, spent the preceding decade in explicit and documented refusal of it. He had built his legitimate business with an architecture that was designed to demonstrate separation from the syndicate, from his father's history, from the world Tadashi Kurosawa still occupied. And Tadashi Kurosawa who was not just a visitor but the current operational head of the Kurosawa syndicate, had apparently spent the better part of 2 years attempting to draw Kenji back into alignment. Not because he needed the money, because Kenji's refusal was in some way Amara had not yet mapped, a structural problem for Kurosawa's legitimacy. And then she found it. It was buried in a folder on a shared network drive she had been given access to for the financial review, misfiled under a label that was deliberately innocuous. It was a document she recognized by its architecture before she recognized it by its content. She had seen similar structures before in a completely different context, in a case involving an insurance company in Dublin. It was a protection protocol, a designed redundancy, a document that described in careful legal language exactly what Amara Osei's presence in Kenji Mori's life was actually meant to accomplish. The protocol was simple in its logic and devastating in its implication. The Kurosawa syndicate had a standing practice, documented in intercepted intelligence that Kenji had apparently obtained through a source she could not identify, of using the intimate partners of resistant targets as leverage, not as direct hostages, as pressure points, women who could be threatened, surveilled, endangered in ways that were plausibly deniable until the target capitulated. Kenji had been resisting this pressure for years by having no intimate partner, no one close enough to be used. The contract arrangement with Amara was not, as she had understood it, simply a cover for professional separation of image management. It was a counter-strategy. By making their arrangement legally formal, publicly visible, and professionally documented, Kenji had created a paper structure that made Amara legally distinct from the category of vulnerable intimate partner. He had surrounded her presence with documentation, employment records, financial transparency, and visibility in a way that made her, on paper, difficult to threaten without creating a paper trail that would expose Kurosawa. He had not, however, told her any of this. She sat in the study for a long time after she finished reading. The window looked out onto the garden, which was raked with the kind of precision that suggests someone tends to it as a practice rather than a chore. There was a maple tree at the far end that had gone the color of embers. She looked at it for a while before she trusted herself to move. She found him on the lower terrace alone, reviewing something on a tablet. He looked up when he heard her. Something shifted in his face, not quite alarm, but the recalibration of a man who had just clocked that a variable had changed. She put the protocol document on the table in front of him. He did not look at it. He already knew what it was. He looked at her. She said, "I want to know every single thing that the contract did not say." What followed was the longest conversation she had ever had with him. He did not apologize. She noted that. He explained, fully, without the evasiveness she had braced for, the history of his family, the years of refusal, the escalating pressure from Kurosawa, the structure of the threat. He told her that he had chosen her specifically because the professional documentation surrounding her would make her a poor target, not an easy one. He told her that he had arranged for her to have access to the household network, specifically because he had anticipated, accurately, that she would find the protocol if she looked, and he had believed she would look. He had, in other words, created conditions for her to discover the truth rather than tell her directly, because he did not know yet whether she was someone who would stay informed or leave. She said, "You let me find it instead of telling me because you wanted to see what I would do when I found it." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is one of the most controlled and arrogant things I have ever heard." He said, "I know." There was a pause. The maple tree did not move. She said, "What is the rest of it? What is the piece of this that you still haven't said out loud?" He was quiet for a moment. That had actual weight. Then he said, "There is an account, accessible only with a code I will give you tonight, that contains documentation of every financial transaction the Kurosawa syndicate has made through legitimate business fronts in the last 8 years. It is the kind of documentation that in the right hands ends careers and begins prosecutions. I have been holding it. I have not used it because using it would make me a target of a different kind. But I assembled it over a long time because I needed to know I had it. I kept it as a last resort. But if something were to happen to me," he paused, I had designed a system for it to reach the right authority without tracing back to anyone still living. I had built you into that system, without your knowledge. She stared at him. He said, your account access, your employment records, your forensic credentials. If I died, the documentation would have transferred to your professional archive automatically, with a cover communication that made it appear you had discovered it through your legitimate review. You would have known what to do with it. You would have been protected by your own professional credibility, and you would have had no prior knowledge, which would have been true and therefore could not be prosecuted for receiving it. He had built her an exit she would only ever need to use if he was dead. He had done it without her consent, with full awareness of what it would require of her, because he had assessed that she was capable of it, and because, she realized, sitting on that terrace with the evening coming in grey from the river, he had trusted her before she had given him any reason to. He had done the worst kind of trusting, the kind that is silent and structural and shows itself only in retrospect. She thought about Nadia, in Bristol, working her way through a rehabilitation program that was slowly returning function to her left hand. She thought about the 41st hour and the pen that was too heavy. She thought about Tadashi Kurosawa in the hallway, saying she has no idea what she is standing in the middle of. She had been right then. She was wrong now. She said, I need 24 hours. He said, of course. She did not leave the house that night. She sat in the study and she went through everything. Not just the protocol, but the full architecture of everything Mori Holdings touched, everything Kenji had built, the negative space of everything he had refused, and the positive space of everything he had constructed in refusal's place. She was looking for what a forensic analyst always looks for, the place where the numbers stop making sense because something human intervened. She found it in the salary records for 12 former employees, people who had left the syndicate orbit years ago and found employment in Mori Holdings subsidiaries. He had been doing it quietly for years, giving people a way out through legitimate work, not announcing it, not claiming credit, just building a door and leaving it unlocked. She thought, this is a man who solves problems by building structures, who protects people by making them appear unprotectable, who trusts by creating conditions rather than asking for permission. She thought, I do not know if I can forgive the arrogance of it. She thought, but I understand exactly what it is. On the 22nd day of the arrangement, Tadashi Kurosawa sent a representative to the Mori residence, not to threaten, but to propose. The proposal was, in the language of organizations like his, reasonable. Kenji would provide an advisory role, non-operational, in the restructuring of 2 legitimate businesses the syndicate was using for financial normalization. In return, the pressure on the people in Kenji's orbit would cease. In return, the arrangement would be peaceful. Kenji showed Amara the proposal. She said, he is testing whether you have anything to protect now. Kenji said, yes, she said, and the answer you are about to give him will either confirm that I am leverage or confirm that I am not. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, let me respond to it. He looked at her for a long time, not with surprise exactly, with something more careful than that. She drafted the response herself in Japanese, with Kenji's correction on 4 phrases that she had conjugated incorrectly, and which would have changed the register from professional to aggressive. The response was addressed to Kurosawa's representative and documented, with precise references to the financial review she had been conducting under her formal employment contract with Mori Holdings, that she had identified in the course of her legitimate work certain anomalous patterns in historical transaction data she had been provided, patterns that appeared to intersect with publicly known regulatory investigations currently underway in the Kansai region. She noted as a professional obligation under international financial law that she would be required to file a preliminary disclosure notice with the relevant oversight body within 72 hours of identifying such patterns, unless she determined on further review that the patterns were inconclusive. She noted that her review was ongoing. She noted that she was very thorough. She did not mention Kenji. She did not reference the syndicate. She did not make a threat. She described in the flat language of a professional doing her job a situation that was already true. She had found anomalous patterns, because she had been given access to documentation Kenji had assembled, and she had let the implications arrive without assistance. It was not leverage. It was professional reality, stated professionally. Kurosawa withdrew the proposal within 36 hours. There were no further visits. Kenji said nothing for a long time after that. Then he said, "You did not use what I gave you. You used what you already were." She said, "Yes, that is the part you could not plan for. You planned for what I might find. You did not plan for what I would decide to do with it once I knew everything." He said, "No, I did not." She said, "I want a new contract, different terms. I want a formal co-directorship of the Financial Review Division, a salary that corresponds to my actual function, and a clause that specifies I am informed in advance of any situation in which my professional presence is being used as a structural element of your personal security. I am not interested in being a piece on a board I cannot see." He said, "Those are fair terms." She said, "I know they are." Nadia called the following Sunday, which was the kind of coincidence that is not really a coincidence, but the simple result of things being better than they were before. Her voice had more energy in it. She had been moved to a more intensive program. She said, "I don't know what you're doing over there, but it sounds like it's working." Amara sat on the terrace where the maple tree was now losing its leaves in slow, deliberate intervals, and said, "I'm doing the thing where I figure out what the real contract is after I've already signed it." Nadia said, "Is that a metaphor?" Amara said, "No. If you are still here, and the fact that you are tells me something about you, then you already understand what this story is really about. It is not about a woman who was deceived and forgave it. It is not about a cold man who learned to love. It is about the moment a person discovers that someone made a decision about their life without asking, and instead of simply leaving or simply staying, she took the decision apart, examined every piece of it, and rebuilt it on her own terms. That is not a romantic resolution. That is something more durable than romance. That is power recovered from the inside of a situation that was designed to contain it. She stayed, not because she had no choice, because she had looked at every choice available to her with the same precision she brought to every ledger, every fraudulent account, every set of numbers someone had arranged to tell only half the truth, and she had decided that this one, rebuilt on terms she had negotiated herself, was the one she was choosing. The contract she had signed in October, with the pen that was too heavy, had been someone else's document. The arrangement she was living in now was hers. She was thorough, as she had written in the letter to Kurosawa's representative. She was always very thorough. If this story stayed with you, if there is a part of it still working in your mind, leave a comment with the one word that describes what Amara did in that 72-hour window. And if you want more stories about women who find the real terms buried in the fine print, subscribe, because that is what we do here, every time.